All right, so in this last lesson, we're going to talk about sustainable growth. So some questions to ask here. Does the term sustainable growth, does it even make sense to use those two words together? Is it self-contradictory? How can we grow anything forever if we live on a planet with limited resources? Is it even desirable to keep growing? What happens if we stop growing? Can we survive or thrive if we do? And can the economy change or develop but not grow? And again, I remind you of these terms that we looked at earlier. GDP is basically the goods and services within that country's borders. GNP is the goods and services by residents of a country. And then quantitative, remember, refers to quantity or amount. Qualitative is quality or the type or the quality of something, okay? So first of all, hopefully you've watched the video. Go ahead and watch it if you haven't. Seems pretty silly. It's about a cartoon hamster. So again, I suggest you watch it if you haven't. But the bottom line here is that nothing can grow forever in nature. Nature is sort of designed and evolved to the point that, a hamster, it's just completely illogical and ridiculous to think that a hamster could continue to grow and grow and grow forever. And so obviously we don't really care. I mean, I like hamsters and all, but we're not really concerned with the hamster growth here. This is an analogy for the economy. And so if it's impossible for, say, a hamster or any other organism to grow forever, isn't it impossible for an economy to grow forever if it's based on extraction of physical resources? And that's the whole point. So to think from a very just basic physics context, is it even makes sense for something that's based on physical resources to grow forever if we don't have unlimited resources? And that's a lot of the premise of Herman Daly's article on sustainable growth. So Herman Daly is a pretty well-known economist. He has been really pushing this belief that we should reconsider this pursuit of growth. For a long time, he won the Right Livelihood Award, which is kind of considered the quote-unquote alternative Nobel Prize. So he's pretty well regarded. Again, he's still writing and researching and so forth. But the overarching questions of this article are, can we grow our way out of poverty and environmental degradation? And is sustainable growth possible, or is it an oxymoron? Okay, so it's fairly dense reading, fairly dense article. Here's an example of a pretty dense series of statements. In its physical dimensions, the economy is an open subsystem of the Earth ecosystem, which is finite, non-growing, and materially closed. Okay, so it's finite Earth. As the economic subsystem grows, it incorporates an ever greater proportion of the total ecosystem into itself and must reach a limit at 100% if not before. Therefore, its growth is not sustainable. The term sustainable growth, when applied to the economy, is a bad oxymoron. So what's he trying to say here? I'm going to state this in kind of a different, more graphical way, I guess you could say. So one way to think of this is current economic models, and this harkens back to what William Rees was saying in his video, is that the environment for the economy, okay, it's sort of seen as a subsystem, okay? So the environment is a place to pull resources from, right? So pull our various resources, trees, water, oil, you name it. Okay, so it's a place to pull resources from and then take our waste and dump into it, okay? So this, again, is exactly what William Rees was saying in a previous lesson, that the way economic models view the environment, it's a place to pull resources from and a place to dump waste into. Again, this is not to state that economists don't care about the environment, it's just that economic models are really, really poor at integrating like the value of nature and so forth other than these two services. But what Daly's saying is this is not actually reality. In reality, the environment is not a subset of the economy. The economy is a subset of the environment. And as the economy grows and grows and continues to use more resources and dump more waste, it continues to expand and take up more and more of the environment's capacity or nature's capacity to regenerate itself. So we need to rethink how economic models view the environment and recognize that the economy must stop at a scale at which the remaining ecosystem can continue to function and renew itself year after year. So this should sound a lot like the steady state economy, ecological footprint, what William Rees was talking about, and so forth. So we need to consider that the economy must stop growing at a point at which the remaining ecosystem can renew itself. Okay, so we need to really rethink how the economy treats the environment. So some key phrases or thoughts here. So again, the economy is an open subsystem of the Earth's ecosystem. So it is part of the Earth's ecosystem. It's dependent upon the Earth's ecosystem. Okay, so its growth is not sustainable. It cannot grow forever as long as it is based on pulling resources from the environment and dumping waste into it. And this is a really important phrase that he mentions in here. When something grows, it gets something blank. When something develops, it gets blank. So think about this phrase. What he says is when something grows, it gets bigger. When something develops, it gets different. In other words, we need to differentiate between growth and development. And so growth means to keep getting bigger. Development doesn't necessarily mean getting bigger, it means changing or becoming different, okay? And so you think about it from the Earth's ecosystem perspective. So the Earth's ecosystems don't grow, but they do develop. If you look at the Earth as an ecosystem, a single ecosystem, it's not getting bigger, okay? It's not growing, right? It's what we have is what we have, but it's constantly developing. I mean, you could think of innumerable examples of things dying, things growing, water moving from place to place, rocks eroding, whatever, you name it. The Earth is constantly changing, constantly in flux, constantly in motion. So it's developing, it's changing all the time, but it's overall, the Earth is finite and it's not growing. And so what he's saying is that if we're looking at sustainable development, that's fine as long as it's development without growth. You hear the term sustainable growth, again, back to the original concept of sustainable growth, which is something that you do hear, and even if you don't hear it stated explicitly, it's implied because if you listen to politicians and business owners and the media and so forth, they just assume that we need to grow forever. We need to grow, 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 and if we stop growing, it's a crisis. So what he's saying is that we can't do that because the Earth itself isn't growing, so we can't continue to grow forever. Just from a very basic physics perspective, the economy must stop growing, okay? It's going to have to stop growing at some point, as long as it's based on the extraction of physical resources. But that doesn't mean it stops. He's not saying we need to get rid of economic activity. Quite the contrary. We can have a non-growing economy, but it can be very dynamic. We can buy and sell goods. We can, recycle things. We can reuse things. But we can have a lot of economic transactions. But that doesn't mean it's growing. Okay, so he's not saying we need to stop the economy from moving. We just need, if we're basing it in physical resources, we need to stop it from growing. But he also states that this is a very tough sell, as growth has this, quote, almost religious connotation of ultimate goodness. And, I'd maybe stop and think about this belief in economic growth as almost a religion. I mean, it's in that, you sort of just believe that economic growth is good. Okay, so it's just, it's not something that we necessarily stop and think about what the growing economy is really doing. It's just taken, it's not meant, it's taken as sort of an article of faith that if the economy grows, it's good, right? And so we just need to grow and everything will be fine. And you hear it all the time that we just need to keep growing, okay? But he says we're already getting these stress-induced feedbacks from the ecosystem, and yet we want to grow more. So we talked about, with climate change and carbon emissions and reducing, the natural areas across the world and all the 9 planetary boundaries and so forth, okay? So we're seeing these stress-induced feedbacks, and yet we continue to want to grow. And so overall, he's asking, is sustainable development an oxymoron? So is sustainable development an oxymoron? And he's saying no, as long as it's development without growth, okay? And so we can have this qualitative improvement of this economic base, okay? We need to maintain a steady state by throughput of matter, energy within its regenerative and assimilative capacities. Again, it's a very dense reading. So what's he saying here? He's basically saying we need to stop growing the economy at a point where the Earth can continue to function and renew itself year after year. Okay, so this is steady state economy. It's ecological footprint of 1 Earth or less. So he's saying we're fine. We can develop all we want. We can change the quality, the nature of the economy. We can buy and sell stuff all we want, as long as we stop growing at a point where the environment, the Earth, can continue to function and renew itself. Okay, so this is all tied into all the themes from this week's lesson. So he also points out the difference between optimize and maximize. And so what he's saying is that we need to, again, to stop growing at a point where the environment can continue to function. So instead of trying to maximize economic output, we should optimize it. So we should find the best type, the best scale, the best economy we can, as opposed to just assuming that as long as we grow, we'll be fine. He's saying, well, we shouldn't assume that. We need to actually think about what's happening as a result of economic growth and come up with the best model for economic activity. He said basically modern economics doesn't really take into account the fact that we're reaching past these limits where the environment can continue to renew itself. Okay. Again, the non-growing economy is not static. Just because it stops growing doesn't mean it stops. It just means it's not growing. So we can have a lot of buying and selling. So, okay, all this is sort of like, okay, here's a problem. We need to do something about it. But he actually provides some concrete solutions. Okay, so it's all, for him, it's all about economic policy. So we need to hold throughput at constant or at least sustainable levels, right? So ways that we can reduce our ecological footprint and achieve a sort of a steady state economy. If we had tax extraction and we use the taxes from extraction, so if you're drilling for oil, we use that to fund, we tax that and fund conservation and preservation. We use that to fund, if you're extracting oil, you can use a tax from that to support the development of solar or other renewable technologies. And just in general, we need to not use renewable resources faster than they can be replenished and cannot emit waste faster than they can be reabsorbed. And for non-renewables, he's basically saying, like, let's just tax them and use it to fund renewables. Again, harvest rates that don't exceed replenishment rates. And again, with non-renewables, if we are creating waste, we need to do it no faster than they can be reabsorbed. Okay, so there are some practical solutions here. So the sort of take home, we need to differentiate between growth and development. Sustainable development is possible, but sustainable growth is an oxymoron, okay? So we can't grow forever on a finite planet. We need to recognize the physical limitations of Earth and stop at a point where the environment can replenish itself, all right? We need to remember that the economy is a subset of the Earth and not the other way around. We need to think about optimizing the economy, not maximizing the economy. We need to not deplete renewable resources faster than they can be replenished, and don't emit waste any faster than they can be absorbed. And again, to be very clear, even Herman Daly, who's very critical of the economic growth model, will tell you that we can grow the economy as long as we're not reducing the capacity of the Earth to regenerate itself. So if we can base a growing economy on sustainable use of renewable resources in a way that we're not creating waste any faster than they can be reabsorbed, that's fine. So he's all about steady state economy. We can grow all we want as long as we're meeting those conditions. And again, the goal should be to maximize the quality of life for the most people, to pull people out of poverty, and so forth. Okay, so that's a summary of Herman Daly's idea of growth versus development.